welcome you here today. Hello, Stephen.
Hello, Amanda. Great to see you again.
Great to see you. So, Stephen, you're going to give us some opening remarks with regards to some global trends that you're seeing that could be worrisome or encouraging, hopefully more on the encouraging side, and also sort of set up the sphere for which you think the Biden administration might have some influence. So we'll hear those remarks from you and then we'll come back for some discussion and questions. So over to you, Stephen.
Thank you. So this has been a year where we have stress tested, unintentionally obviously, but we've stress tested our global interdependence and our political and socioeconomic systems. And we've learned a lot. We've learned a lot about globalization, and we've learned a lot about our individual systems within the globe. However, there's been quite a lot of surprise, and we have to admit that we've been surprised, and more surprises are likely to come. You can recall the ancient history of stagflation of the 1970s, which was not supposed to exist, both economic contraction and high inflation simultaneously. Not a lot of people foresaw the collapse of the Soviet Union. Not a lot of people foresaw the revival of Russia after that collapse, or the rise of China, or the more recent aggressive posture of China, let alone the recent pandemic. So it's been surprise after surprise, and of course more surprises are coming. And the nature of surprise is, of course, that we cannot predict until after it happens. I'm not going to touch on economics because Amanda has Nathan Sheets on the program today, the chief economist and head of global economic research at PGIM, fixed income. And I'm not going to do democracy because we have Tom Carruthers immediately following this particular session. I'm going to hit on four themes, and I'm going to approach the Biden presidency by those structural or contextual factors that are not something the Biden presidency can do much about. So in other words, let's put the Biden presidency in context first before we talk about what we could possibly expect from it. So of those 4 points I'm going to briefly touch on, the first is technology. We just had the excellent vaccine panel, and it's clear that we're in a new era already. The vaccine that's just rolled out in the UK does not inject people with the virus. It is instead a genetically manipulated vaccine. It uses messenger RNA to get the body functions working. This use or manipulation of biology, of life, is now going to transform just about everything in our economy and daily life. It's already happening now. And it's not just healthcare, as we see with the vaccine, but it extends to agriculture, it extends to energy, and as I said, it's already happening. This revolution in biology and manipulation of life is really the third technological revolution of the last 100 years. First was the quantum or nuclear revolution. Then, of course, there was the computer information internet revolution. Those two are now coming together in quantum computing on the horizon. And then, of course, the biotechnology one. The Biden administration will have very little influence over this colossal eruption in our lives. The second, of course, is demography. All investors understand the power of demography. We have two global demographic trends that are simultaneous right now. One is the colossal increase in the middle class in Africa and Asia, and the opportunities and challenges that this presents. Few investors are going to want to miss out on the growth of the middle class across Asia and Africa, which is set for the next several decades to be decisive in the global economy. At the same time, there's another demographic trend, which is, of course, the graying of more established regions. So, for example, Italy and Japan are leaders in this, where very large populations over 60 already are visible. That's normally seen as a problem, but of course it's a massive opportunity because the gray market is very, very large and very high consumption oriented, no longer saving the way those people were when they were young. This simultaneity of graying of the world as a market opportunity and vast expansion of the middle class as a market opportunity is simultaneous, not just globally, but inside one country, and that's China. China will be both the biggest gray market soon and the biggest middle class market soon, which is pretty extraordinary that these two trends come together in a single country. Once again, this is critical for investors going forward not to miss out on these drivers of growth, but the Biden presidency will have very little impact on any of this. A third is our measurement challenges. Measurement is currently broken. This is a problem across just about everything we do. GDP, productivity, shareholder versus stakeholder capitalism, MMT, modern monetary theory, racial categories like people of color when the predominant trend is mixed race to the extent that race is meaningful. All of these ways that we measure who we are and what we do and where should we invest are all under serious challenge right now. And there have been answers to them, but none of the answers have been scaled. The computer revolution came and productivity didn't seem to come up. It didn't compute, so to speak, right? Shareholder and stakeholder capitalism is an argument about values, but it's also an argument about measurement. What's measured, how it's measured, and therefore what's rewarded or what's punished. The Biden administration will have little to do with this as well, this very big trend. If you look at the technology trend, the manipulation of life, if you look at the demography, the vast expansion and opportunity of gray market, middle class markets simultaneously, and the measurement challenges, these are all global structural trends, massive importance for investors, and little connection to a Biden presidency. All right, let me get to my fourth point, geopolitics, and spend a little bit more time on this, because here the Biden presidency will or could potentially have an impact. In geopolitics, if you look at the Middle East, we'll do Middle East, Europe, and East Asia, China briefly. If you look at the Middle East, we're still grappling with the United States' destruction of Saddam Hussein and the Iraqi regime, which was an unintentional elimination of the key deterrent for Iran. And the U.S., having knocked over Saddam and empowered Iran unintentionally, has been looking ever since for a way to balance Iranian power in the Middle East. The current coalition of the UAE and the Saudis and Bahrain, etc., is in a way an attempt to restore that balance against Iranian power regionally that Saddam represented, but that, as I said, we unwittingly destroyed that balance against Iran and empowered Iran. A second structural factor there has been the fracking revolution. The fracking revolution was also unforeseen, and what that technological breakthrough did was it made it possible to punish the Iranian regime. Whether you like that policy of the U.S. administration or you don't, it was made possible by fracking because taking Iranian oil off global markets had no effect or little effect on global markets because fracking came on board prior to that. And so in the Middle East, we see this churning over the Iranian problem from the American point of view. However, we do see now two tremendously important underlying factors, new structures. One is Israel is now a technological giant, and the Arab states want a piece of that. They want relations with Israel. They want technology transfer. They want new economies because they see that the future of hydrocarbons is uncertain, and basing your GDP, your wealth, your domestic and international position on hydrocarbons indefinitely doesn't make sense anymore. They need a new economy, and Israel represents a vision of that new economy and a potential partner. Secondly, there's a young population in the Middle East, and they need jobs, employment. there needs to be economic dynamism in order to take care of this burgeoning young population. So if you put these two trends together, the desire for a new economy as hydrocarbons come under question and the burgeoning of a young population, we're seeing the need, not the reality, but the need for a new Middle East. And here Biden will have to tread very carefully because it is the coalition against Iran that seems to be driving the Arab-Israeli rapprochement and the need for a new economy. But of course, Iran has to be part of any long-term solution in the Middle East to bring stability. And of course, Turkey, as a rogue actor, has introduced yet another element of instability in the Middle East. So the Middle East is not stable, but there is a vision of a future Middle East that transcends the current limitations, but that would have to include Iran, based upon an economy that's not predominantly hydrocarbon driven, but is instead technology and jobs driven. All right, let's move to the EU. A lot of drama this week, especially over Brexit. Brexit, of course, is a problem because it's based on a lie. Whether you're pro-Brexit or you're anti-Brexit, the dream of unlimited sovereignty for the UK comes up against the problem of interdependence. You cannot be fully sovereign in an interdependent world if you want to take advantage of the interdependence. So the contradiction between wanting to be completely sovereign and yet being part of the world has led to all of the drama, melodrama, Sturm und Drang, the failure to get a deal, because it's very difficult to square this circle and to acknowledge that the vision, whether you share it or you're against it, is based on an impossibility. That is to say, full sovereignty in a world in which you sell 70% of your fish, for example, to the continent. And so we're going to see this drama continue. It is not, however, strategically as important as the other trends in the EU. Britain was ambivalent about being in the EU when it was in it. It was about the EU when it's out of it. And so that has not changed as much as we think. There are significant impacts on the UK, less significant on the EU for the drama, but much bigger for the EU is the problem that they are a monetary union and not a fiscal union, and there's no prospect to become a fiscal union, and that contradiction will persist. And the muddling through up till now has been largely successful. The austerity, of course, had huge effects, both economically and politically. But nonetheless, the ability to hold the EU together despite this inherent contradiction has been impressive. There is, however, a new contradiction, which is not just between the Club Med South and the frugal North, but between the EU as a system of values, the EU as a system based on rule of law, and the new illiberal, as they call themselves, regimes in Eastern Europe. So now it's no longer the frugal North and the Club Med South, but also the illiberal East. Hungary in the first instance, Poland, potentially Bulgaria and Romania, and the spread of this. The EU has been much more proactive recently about the erosion of democratic norms and rule of law, and looks serious to try to do something about it, and has limited tools, but is trying to use those tools. If the EU fails to take significant action over the illiberal trend in the East, this is potentially extremely damaging to the survival of the EU as more than just an economic community, but also as a community of values. In the meantime, however, let's remember that the EU is a regulatory giant. The EU is such a big market and is really little more than a regulatory mechanism when push comes to shove on a grand scale. But its regulatory bureaucracy is able to impose rules across the world because countries want to sell into the EU market. So you may be a Nebraska farmer and you may feel that you're as sovereign as can be and you live in the United States, but you don't use pesticides when you grow your food because you want to export to the EU, and those are the rules you must abide by. This regulatory giant is often overlooked because the EU is such a military, how to say this politely, a non-player. And yet it is this regulatory giant. And so you hear a lot now about rapprochement, about Biden and Europe coming back together in the transatlantic alliance. But I would caution that there are issues here having to do with the EU's regulatory power that are not going to be easy to overcome because it requires, just as in the case of the UK, it requires acknowledgement that American sovereignty is not 100% globally because of this interdependence. And the transatlantic alliance brings tremendous benefits, but it also brings some costs that need to be taken into account. Finally, on the China piece, before we wrap up on what the Biden presidency could bring us, on the China piece, what you're seeing right now is China has consolidated a global anti-China alliance in a way that no one else could possibly have done. And so countries are now coming together in order to meet the challenges that China seems to represent. And this is having a domestic effect in countries as well. For example, left and right coming together on the need to meet the China challenge, as well as global alliances getting refreshed because of the China challenge. I would caution here once again that China is seen as a means to an end. Everyone has domestic problems. Oh, China will help us overcome them. They'll help us overcome our domestic divisions. Alliances need to be refreshed. Oh, China. China will help us refresh those alliances. China is now the solution to just about everything in many people's eyes. And I would say to that we need to have a China policy which is about China, not just about our other issues that we think China can help us resolve. There is little that is win-win in this particular instance. Connectivity in the world will either be in a Western, U.S., democratic-centric sphere, or it will be in a China-centric one. China has divided the internet. It's divided global communications by the way it manages connectivity through censorship and other means. We didn't do that. They did. The world is now divided in those spheres. And so that's not a win-win situation. Either you're in China's 5G or you're in someone else's 5G. Either you use China's undersea cables or you use somebody else's undersea cables. Freedom of navigation is also not win-win. Either the South China Sea is open for freedom of navigation or it's Chinese territory and they get to decide. And so there are many issues, unfortunately, which are not win-win. And China has done, as I said, more than anyone thought possible to consolidate this burgeoning, embryonic anti-China coalition, both in domestic countries and globally. The problem with that is that even though many things are not win-win, China is not going away, and the world needs to figure out how to live with China. There needs to be a combination of deterrence and diplomacy, not only deterrence, not only coalitions to fight, but also coalitions to continue to integrate and to benefit. Not only bans on technology, but sharing of technology when it's not a matter of national security. Here, the Biden administration has a potentially very big role to play, but we'll see if they're up to that role. Okay, let me summarize now at the end, talk about the Biden presidency. It's hard to imagine a better situation for Biden than the one that he's in right now. He campaigned on healing wounds, he campaigned on normalcy, and as we saw in the previous panel, he's got a vaccine. There's a lot of hysteria around the vaccine, as if distribution of the vaccine is some type of unprecedented challenge. The United States, for all its faults, distributes 70 million plus flu vaccines in 2 months every fall. I got one myself. And it distributes them through the corner pharmacies. And so the idea that we won't be able to distribute a vaccine when Walmart and Amazon and FedEx manage logistics across the entire planet in the billions of packages seems to me a little bit on the hysterical side, although I agree that the vaccine must be distributed equitably and not only to those countries that can afford it. That's the challenge, rather than the logistics challenge per se. So the Biden presidency, heal the wounds, normalcy, and he's got a vaccine. He's got potential economic revival. He doesn't have a financial crisis and unemployment, which is how Obama came to power in 2008 for hope and change, when the global financial crisis ushered him in to power. Biden has something else entirely, the vaccine plus potential economic revival. Plus, Biden is more popular than his own party. He did much better in the election than a Democratic Party. So he's got an excuse not to give in to any utopianism on the left. The Republicans are still in charge, it looks like, in the Senate, and in any case, the margin is small in the Senate and the margin is small in the House. In fact, there's no Republican coalition anymore. There's only an anti-liberal coalition, which is very unstable, and a civil war on the Republican side over Trump or not Trump. So tailor-made for success. How could you mess this up? You've got all the ingredients you need for a successful presidency. You only have to be modest. You only have to pick your battles. You only have to go for the low-hanging fruit like rural broadband and other infrastructure to pass through Congress. You only your alliances, talk again to your Democratic friends, and let the Republican civil war over Trumpism play out. However, there are some headwinds here for Biden. One, there are domestic limitations on the internationalism. We have on the right now a nativism, which is very different from Ronald Reagan's internationalism. And we have on the left a critique of American power in the world and a critique of trade agreements and a critique of our wars or our militarization of our involvement abroad that also constricts domestically what you can do vis-a-vis your alliances and your trade agreements abroad. So that's a very big headwind. There's also the culture war and identity politics temptations on the left, which we see play out. There was a very surprising and to me troubling pick by Biden for the Health and Human Services cabinet position. All the talk about science and the need to follow the science, and then he picked a partisan hack to lead Health and Human Services, the most important cabinet position in many ways. And so these temptations, plus the headwinds, could undermine Biden's own very tailor-made for success potential presidency. And so we're going to see now whether Biden lives up to his promise of being the heal the wounds, return to normalcy, roll out the vaccine, bask in the economic revival, watch the Republicans eat each other and be more popular than your own party, or instead he's going to indulge some of these domestic temptations and hit up against these headwinds over internationalism that are very deep across the political spectrum. There's a lot of cause to be optimistic. The biotechnology revolution has potential upsides that are enormous globally. The demographic trends look like they're very troubling, but also present huge opportunities. The measurement challenges are a failure, but we can correct them, or at least attempt to move in the direction of correction. And the geopolitics, even in the Middle East, there are some positive trends that can be taken advantage of. And in Europe, there are some significant positive trends dealing with the illiberal East rather than exclusively focusing on the Brexit melodrama. And then on the China side, there is a global coalition emerging, and there will be an emerging understanding that China is not going away. And so let's figure out how to live with them as well as how to stand up to them. And so in the end, it doesn't look as difficult as the original Obama 2008. Despite the pandemic and everything else we see, there is a moment of opportunity here for success if it is seized. Anyway, thank you for your attention. Those are my remarks.
Thank you very much, Stephen. As always, so much in there. We've got some questions coming through from the audience, but I just want to refer a little bit to this point that you're making about internationalism. And Biden has nominated Antony Blinken as Secretary of State. I'm interested in your view of him. He's been couched as an internationalist. Are we going to expect from him and from the administration more of a traditional role in that Secretary of State in international relations that the United States has in the past been, and their position in the world? Is that going to return to a kind of some sort of normalcy, do you think?
There's going to be a very different rhetoric. There are going to be very different optics, and there's going to be a lot less tension. However, there's still going to be conflicts of interest, and there's still going to be limitation. Even in dealing with China, where there is this emergent coalition, there are of opinion about how far to go in confronting China. What we should watch out for as investors is what's going to be the use or manipulation of the climate change agenda. There's going to be a whole lot of feel-good meetings and policies which are not going to be rooted in legislation or global treaties, and are not going to be necessarily rooted in private sector action, to revive a sense that climate change is a serious challenge that needs to be met. This is why he's appointed John Kerry, who is an experienced diplomat, as his effective climate change ambassador. You can do a lot building bridges back to your allies and potentially even build a bridge back to China with a climate change agenda in a political sense. You can also rebuild or hold your coalition domestically in the Democratic Party by looking like you're tackling climate change seriously. So whereas Blinken will help with the optics and the tone, it's Kerry as well, in parallel, a former Secretary of State, pushing a climate change political bridge globally and domestically that we should watch out for. Of course, we need a whole lot more innovation in the energy sphere. We've plateaued on renewables. We have a lot of challenges with storage and capacity and the electrical grid and many other issues that your audience knows well about that require very significant private sector solutions. However, we're going to see people talk about alliances, talk about friends, talk about democracy, talk about climate change, talk about win-win, talk about getting China on board on climate change despite their massive domestic coal consumption. However, we're going to need something more than that in order to move the dial.
Stephen, there's a question here from Sanford Rich, who's the Executive Director of New York City Board of Education Retirement System. He says, do you expect that the progressive wing of the Democratic Party to have significant influence in the Biden presidency, and what are the consequences of either a yes or no to that question?
They're going to have symbolic influence, but whether they have policy influence or not is not going to be determined solely by Biden, but going to be determined by the makeup of the House and the Senate, as well as the state legislatures, the state houses and state senates, which are not in Democratic hands. And so the limit on the progressive wing is not Biden alone or even predominantly, but it's the fact that the progressive wing of the Democratic Party is a minority in the Democratic Party, let alone inside the U.S. I will say this, however. There will be a lot of politics, or what we would call identity politics, appointments that are made which supposedly reflect America, So, for example, there will be highly qualified African Americans appointed to high and important posts, highly qualified Hispanics appointed to important posts, etc. This will be said to reflect America. It will be said that the Biden administration looks like America, and that's not true because Americans don't make $500,000 or $1 million a year, which is what the Biden cabinet members do make. There will be no members of the Biden cabinet making $70,000 a year or $35,000 a year. In other words, there will be no members of the Biden cabinet who look like America. And that challenge is more fundamental than the influence the progressive wing will have. We need an equality of opportunity agenda, which is not an identity politics agenda. It's not about how many women CEOs there are in Fortune 500 companies. It's about how many women who are single mothers and don't have enough support can get their kids with a good education, including in the place in New York City where your questioner is from. And so we need an equality of opportunity agenda, which is a bipartisan agenda. The Republicans are in favor of equality of opportunity, not just the Democrats. And so if we can move away from the politicized categories of identity politics, progressive wing, anti-progressivism, and move towards consensual categories like equality of opportunity, and forget about whether the Biden cabinet looks like America, but instead talk about how the Biden cabinet with Republicans in Congress are providing greater opportunity in New York City, including in the school system where my children also go to school in New York City schools, like your questioner.
Stephen, another question here from someone in New York City, Bill Lee, who you know well from our in-person events, CIO of the New York Presbyterian Hospital. And this is a question that may flow over into the next session. So if it does, let's keep the answer short. But Bill says, are liberal, small L liberal governments on the decline, or have things stabilised?
Yeah, I'm going to let Tom Carruthers from the Carnegie Endowment answer Bill's very important question. The stress of democracy, an entire session following this one is on your program, Amanda. Great foresight on your part. And so, Bill, I think you're going to get a very detailed, sophisticated answer to your question very soon, following me.
Two quick questions before we go to Tom. Stephen, one from Edwin Lowe, who is an investor here in Australia, and it's past 1 a.m, so I can't not ask that question of Edwin. Thanks for tuning in. Are populist movements around the world partly a manifestation of elite conflict? If so, how can we counteract elite overproduction?
A very great question, and this is close to my heart. And so what we have is not populism. Populism is the term that the establishment has given to this. What we have is anti-system. People who are anti-system because they feel the system is failing. Populism is nothing more than policies geared towards the populace, towards the people. Any democratic system should be highly responsive to the people through voting and other mechanisms. Our systems are less responsive than they need to be. Once again, we'll let Tom Carruthers go into details and analysis on this. Believe it or not, I'm a populist, but I'm pro-system. I'm for the kind of policies that provide broader, more inclusive, and more enduring opportunity for more people. To me, that's what populism means. I'm not anti-press. I'm not anti-rule of law. I'm not anti-free and fair elections. And so I'm not anti-system. But once again, we're going to get an expert very soon to go into greater detail. But I agree with your Australian questioner that this responsiveness of systems beyond just elites, beyond just establishments, is the core challenge, not just in the US, but globally, including to an extent even in my favorite country, Australia.
Stephen, two more questions and then we'll move on. We've got a question here from Ramana Ramaswamy, who's a senior portfolio manager in macro strategies at the Canadian Pension Plan Investment Board. Could you expand a bit more on the potential civil war in the Republican Party? So far, it seems that the Republican Party is largely behind Trump, with a small section opposed. Is this likely to change?
It's another very good question. And so there's the difference between noise and reality. We have to pay attention not to what we see on cable TV, what we see with polls with loaded questions, what we see on social media. We have to pay attention to what we just experienced in the United States, which was to say that Trump lost the election. Most people don't understand that Trump got a lower percentage of the vote in both elections, in 2016 when he won and in 2020 when he lost. He got a lower percentage of the vote than Mitt Romney got against Obama. There is not a Trumpian country to the extent that we've been given that impression. There is an anti-liberal coalition. There is a pro-establishment Republican wing. There is an evangelical Christian wing. And there is the Trump cult of the personality. That's a phenomenon, and it's amplified by our polarization industry or information entertainment complex. But I would caution to extrapolate that this is some enduring question. There are many people who identify as Republicans who will now, in the new context, voice different views, and there will be a struggle for the heart and soul of a center-right party, which is a healthy phenomenon in any country. And I don't predict the outcome, but I don't think that the Trump phenomenon is as enduring. It's not completely ephemeral, but I don't think it's as enduring as it may seem. In fact, there's a fade already underway, however slow.
Stephen, we've got lots of questions here. I know in the past you've been very generous in answering those questions afterwards, and we might need to get you to do that. I just wanted to give a shout out to Henry Levy, who's the chair of the Alameda County Employees Retirement Association, has asked a question. Joanna Zappio, advisor to the Asset Liability Management Committee at Hoop in Canada. But we've got time only for one more question. And even though you and I did discuss that we wouldn't talk about the T word, there have been lots of questions here about Trump, and I can't resist Jeremy here, who works in private equity at the University of Chicago Endowment. There are lots of conspiracy theories and desperate legal manoeuvres by President Trump and his allies. Is there any probability at all, in your estimation, that Joe Biden does not get inaugurated in January?
Absolutely zero probability of anything other than a Biden inauguration on January 20th. The issue for Trump at this point is whether he's man enough to show up at the inauguration and acknowledge that there is a peaceful transfer of power, or he continues his embarrassing and really harmful campaign, harmful globally to America's reputation. I hope that Trump is able to rise to the occasion and show up at the inevitable Joe Biden inauguration on January 20th. Having said that, I'll also say that many of the policies that Trump initiated need to be reevaluated outside of the negative media ecosystem. And so Trump will be judged historically not only for his behavior, which has been abominable, but also for policies where there is a legitimate debate.
Stephen, wonderful to talk to you as always. We will give you now just a couple of minutes to prepare for your session with Thomas Carruthers. Thank you very much for your time, and we'll see you in a few minutes.